Okay, I think we can start. So thanks everybody for joining. I'm Jan, I'm part of the marketing team here at ArangoDB, and I will be basically your host and the host of the webinar. And today's topic is how you can save time and do more cool stuff with Oasis. And I'm especially happy that we have two guests today. So first of all, thank you so much, Ayal Rosenberg from Weill, for joining today. Really happy to have you here. Ayal is a co-founder and CTO of Weill, and he will for sure expand a bit later on what you're doing and what cool stuff you're doing with ArangoDB and Oasis. So thanks a lot for joining, Ayal.
Thank you.
And I'm also very excited that Ewout could make it. So Ewout is our, one of the leading minds behind Oasis, the cloud service of ArangoDB. And you can all imagine he's quite busy. So I'm very happy that you could make the time. You will share a few very interesting aspects on Oasis, what is coming up, what improved over the last few weeks. So Ewout, thank you so much for making the time, and welcome.
Okay, thank you, Jan. So first of all, everyone, welcome, special welcome to Ayal. Very glad that you are here. And as Jan said, today we are going to talk about Oasis. So let's start very quickly. Who am I? Jan already explained it a little bit. I'm responsible for the Oasis platform. There's a small team within ArangoDB, and we're working very hard to optimize the entire platform, make sure that everything is running stable, and we're trying to make it as exciting platform as you can be. But of course, we don't want to make it too exciting, because infrastructure and exciting is usually not a very good combination. So we try to keep it a bit calm here. So what we're going to talk about tonight, today, whatever your time zone is the following. We're first going to talk about what it takes to bring any software product, but in this case, specifically a database from the developer workbench into production. There are lots of misconceptions there. What you need to do, what you can easily overlook, and what it actually will take. By the way, there is a question, will the webcast be available as recording? Yes, it will also be recorded. Then we're going to look at, okay, if you now change this approach and try to do it with Oasis, what does it take then? And I'm very glad that we're going to hear from an actual experienced user in this case who has gone through that transition and can tell us, give us his insight in that and how it's being done at Weill and what we have there. And then the second half of the webinar is going to be about the improvements that we've done to Oasis over the last few months. And also, and it's probably the most interesting part, at the end, what's coming in the next couple of months. With that, we're just kicking off. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them as soon as possible. So let's introduce. So we're first going to take a database. As I said, it can be any data software product, but we're going to take a database and bring it from the workbench of a developer into a production. It sounds so simple, and a lot of developers actually believe that it is simple and say, well, you can do that, but is that really true? And what does it really take in order to do that? Now, if you look at ArangoDB, taking it to a developer workbench is very easy. You can just, with a single command, and I've had it here on the slide, you can run it in Docker, and you can start playing around with it. You don't spend any time on it. It's just a minute to start it up. You have a fully functional database at your disposal. But of course, fully functional on the developer workbench. So you can play with it, you can learn with it, You have it available on your local host. And it allows you to do a couple of things. First of all, you can learn AQL. AQL is the query language for ArangoDB. And you can interactively play with that in the web UI of the database. You can import data there. You can do a lot of fun stuff with it. You can learn all the ArangoDB APIs. They're actually listed in the web UI itself. You can play them there. You can test your application against it. So there's a lot of things that you can do on the developer workbench, but still, it's only the developer workbench. And the time you've taken so far, if you're learning AQL, you're learning the ArangoDB APIs, it's anywhere from a couple of days to a couple of weeks, depending on how experienced you are already with either ArangoDB or previous database experiences and so on. But it's not a lot of time, all in all. But the key part is, what don't you get when you're running it like I showed on the developer workbench? And that's actually quite a lot. And it sounds like very simple topics. And we will address these topics one by one. First of all, provisioning of servers. Even in a time when a lot of people are talking about serverless and how easy that is, and the cloud, and what have you, you still need to set up servers. You can do that in the cloud, and it's fairly easy to do. You just spin up, have your credit card handy, and you spin it up on AWS or Google or any of the cloud providers. But you're not done when you're just spinning up the servers. You also have to set up the operating system. You have to configure firewalls. All that things is also part of the provisioning of servers. And for those who are in larger enterprises, they know, and they do not have the joy of using something like the public cloud. It can literally take months. I think we've all been there when we ask a IT department, can you please provision some additional pizza boxes in the data center for us? And they say, yeah, we will do it. And we're very quick, so you'll have it in 3 months' time. Nowadays, things are moving faster, but still, it's taking a lot of time. And then you have your servers, which is all great. You have to keep updating them, of course. And then we're moving to the next topic. And the next topic is high availability. What do I mean with that? If you're running ArangoDB in a Docker container like I showed you, or even if you just don't like Docker and run it somewhere else, if you just run a single instance, chances are extremely high that that is going to fail at some point. Not because the software is bad or terrible or whatever, but there is always a risk with servers. And even if you have the most perfect server that has an uptime of no matter what, you need to do maintenance, you need to bring in software updates and so on. So at some point, you have to take care of the availability of your database, even if you're doing maintenance on that database. With ArangoDB, you can do that fairly easy. At least from a concept point of view, because ArangoDB comes with a so-called cluster model. You can run a series of ArangoDB servers, and together they form a cluster. There are special types of servers, which we call coordinators and database servers and so on, but I won't go into the details of that. There are lots of good tutorials on our website for that. But what it means is that a lot of servers together form this database for you. And together ensure that there is always one server available to handle your request. So you can take one down, upgrade it, bring it back up, and the rest will just continue. And more important, your application and therefore your data is still available to the application and therefore also to your clients. Doing that the right way is not easy. So even when we try to make it as easy as possible for customers to do it the right way, you still have to mess around with load balancers, and you have to take care of a lot of edge cases, because of course the high availability is only worth as much as how available can you actually make it, because in the end all servers can fail in worst case, and you want to avoid that. So it's really the devil is in the detail there. And that's also where it takes a lot of time. Just setting up a standard high availability environment will easily take a week or more. And that's not counting the actual experience in running it. Then the next step. Pretty much any serious production enterprise nowadays needs encryption. That can be encryption on the network. It can be encryption at rest, so for the disk, or both, which I think you should do. And encryption itself is baked into ArangoDB, so it's not that complicated again to set it up, but just setting it up is just part of the story. You have to make sure for encryption you need certificates, and certificates need to be rotated. We all know that these things have a limited time to live. At least you want to do that from a security point of view. So you want to rotate your certificates. That requires, again, a certain operational activity that's costing you time. You have to set it up, you have to test it, and you actually have to perform it. All that is, again, easily taking a week, 2 weeks. You spend that just like that. Even though all the tools are there, it's still a lot of work to do it, and especially to do it right. And the key part with encryption, of course, is you want to do it right. You don't want to be the company that finds out, hey, we made this problem and now we made this failure somewhere in the process, and for that reason our data is now compromised in one way or another. So it's a really critical part. That is also true for the next topic, and the next topic is backups. Even when you have high availability, and with high availability you also have aspects like replication factors of data, which means that the data is not written to one disk, but it's at least written to 2 disks and so on. You still want to take backups, and for different reasons. First of all, in the end, all hardware can fail. So data centers can burn down. There are lots of terrible things that can happen, and you want to prevent that. But there's also another aspect that we often forget, and that's not only that the database or the hardware can fail, it's also that your application can fail. And that's usually a much higher risk, and the effect of that risk is also much higher, because let's say that you're doing an upgrade of your application, and a developer who was doing an update of that application was not completely awake yet, and he misconfigured something. It could lead to data loss at that point. You want to quickly roll back to a previous version. You can easily do that nowadays with all kinds of DevOps operations or GitOps or whatever you prefer to use. But if your data is not there, then you have a problem. So you want to make sure that you do backups frequently. And therefore, you also want to have different set of backups. For example, you can do backups that just take snapshots, like point in time very quickly, once every hour, once every 30 minutes, whatever. So if something happens, you can very quickly go back to a well-known state. But the other side of backups is you want to have backups that are long-lasting. So they are, in the very old days, we would say put them on a tape, but now we say put them in the cloud in S3 or somewhere where you have a very, very high retention period options. And the last thing that people very often forget with backups, or actually 2 things. One, you need to test that you can also restore, because the best possible backup is great, but if you have never tried the restore operation, You don't want to be the guy who wakes up at 2 a.m. in the morning figuring out how do I have to do the restore operation because you have never tried that. So that should be something that you know how to do, that you have described, that you've tried and tested, and all that again takes time, of course. And last but not least, for backups, and which is actually true for most of the topics, and it is that you have to keep an eye on these things over time. You want to make sure that your backup actually keeps running. So if you say, I'm taking a kind of snapshot every 2 hours, you want to make sure that it's actually being done every 2 hours. And if something goes wrong, that you're notified about that. And that brings me to the next topic. And the next topic is monitoring. And what is monitoring about? It's actually about getting insight into your running system. So it's not only telling me, are the backups still functional as I expect them to be, but it's also telling me, am I overloading my database? Or maybe the opposite. Maybe you have way too many resources thrown at your database and you don't need it. So it's all about insight, seeing what's going on. But that's half of the story. The other half of the story is about alerting. And that is, you have certain thresholds. If your disk runs full, you want to take action. If you see that your database at 6 a.m. in the morning, every morning runs out of memory, or at least is slowing down because it's slow on memory, you want to know why, and you want to see what's going on. But of course, monitoring can bring you to the point where you actually know that every morning at 6 a.m., your database is under stress. And what is hard on monitoring for any application, but definitely also for databases, is you have lots of tooling nowadays to track what's going on. You have tools like Prometheus and dashboarding tools, and lots of tools there that help you. But in the end, the big question is, what do you need to monitor? And that's a very hard question, because once you start with a product, you can, of course, take the approach and say, I'm just going to save everything. All the metrics that this thing is throwing at me, I'm storing everything, and maybe it's useful at some point. Then you have tons and tons of data. But do you have the right data? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe it's more interesting to have a longer retention period and filter your data up front. Could be. You know that only because you're doing it. And that is quite a challenge. I can tell you from our experience in Oasis that actually the majority of time that we're spending on the Oasis platform, in terms of all the automation and what have you, is spent on monitoring. How can we make sure that we know what's going on, that we can act before things actually start to show failures and so on. And that is really a big challenge, and it's really taking a lot of time. That can take weeks, months, easily. And then I've already mentioned it quite a lot today, is upgrades. If you look at the product of ArangoDB, it is an actively maintained and developed database. So we're adding new features on a daily basis. We are fixing bugs on a daily basis, and you name it. And you can say, well, I don't really care. It works for me, so I'm not going to change it. But every now and then, we also find there are bugs in underlying libraries, or there can be security issues. Do you really want to sit on a very old version when you know that there is a security fix? The answer is usually no. And I think the answer should be no. But then you have the typical approach of any operations guy that says, okay, it's working, so don't touch my working system because I don't want to break it again. But it also means that you need to be a bit flexible there and work with your upgrade. And you have to understand how you do the upgrade. So it's not only the actual procedure of, yeah, I need to shut down the server, replace it with a new version, bring it back up, and then do the next, and so on. That procedure is well documented. It's not a problem, and there are tools out there that help you do that. The challenge is also, can you test your application against it? And maybe, and we see a lot of customers that actually do want to do that. Maybe you want to, if you're running a new version of the database, you want to first test your application against that. And then the key part is, again, hey, it's great that I can test my application against a new version of the database, but if it doesn't have the same amount of data, or at least a similar amount of data, what are you really testing? So there are a lot of things there around upgrades that make it a very interesting subject, but also a subject where you can spend a lot of time getting things right. And if you don't want to take that time, you have to be a bit careful and see, okay, what's going to happen next. And then I come on my last point on this list. And it's probably actually, it's the most important one. And it's also the most difficult to plan. And it's the most difficult to explain for the, let's say, the non-operational people. And that is what we call operational experience. I see it in the Oasis team that there are a few guys in there that live and breathe these things. They know how to operate the things, they are fluent with it, and then you can say that doing this kind of operations, I usually consider it to be an art. It's really a beauty to see how these guys can do that, but it takes a lot of experience. And any system that you have running in production brings a certain amount of experience, or requires a certain amount of experience when you are running it in a production environment. And it's these tiny tips and tricks and do's and don'ts that make it, first of all, very interesting, because you find these things that even the developers of your product may have never thought of. But it's also, it takes a lot of time to get that right. And that is time that you can, an experience that you can only gain in one way, and that's by actually doing it. And that's actually running it in production. So we have now listed a bunch of things that you need to do to go from your developer workbench into a production environment. And in conclusion, if you're running a database in production, first of all, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of experience, despite all the documentation that we bring, that other databases out there bring. And it also, and that's usually, it's quite easy to overlook, it is a continuing effort even after the launch. It's not something like, yeah, it's working, don't touch it anymore, we're done. It doesn't work that way. So overall, if you add all the topics that we have addressed so far, you're spending many months in developer time to actually get there. And of course, that doesn't mean that it takes months from now till it's done. You can throw more developers at it, more operations people at it, but still, the effort is still there, and you have to deal with that. This was how you do it without a managed service. All the things that you have to take care of when you're doing it on your own, whether that's on-prem, whether that's in the cloud, it doesn't make that much difference. So we're now going to look at the same process from the developer workbench, but now we're moving to a managed service, specifically to Oasis. And then also there are interesting statements that people make. A managed service solves all my problems. Is that true? Maybe, let's see. But if not, and it's of course the interesting part, what is missing then? So let's have a look at Oasis. Oasis is the managed service for ArangoDB. You go to cloud.arangodb.com and you register and set up your account. That's literally a few minutes worth of work. You set up an email address and so on. and you create your first deployment. And deployment is just a fancy name for saying an ArangoDB cluster, which we spin up for you automatically in the cloud. So it's not that we have a huge amount of people that sitting there waiting for you to request anything. There's just everything is automated. And then you get started. And what do you get with Oasis? We're looking at again at the same list. And actually, I've highlighted here with some very bold check marks. The majority of topics that we discussed before come out of the box with Oasis. So provisioning servers, don't have to worry about it, all being done by Oasis itself. High availability, same story. It's just done by Oasis, and you don't have to care about it. It just is there for you. Encryption, same story. Backups, mostly the same story. We make it easy for you to make backups. We give you a default policy of backups, but if you want to change that and say, well, I don't want to go with the default 2-hour backups, I want to do every 30 minutes, for example, you can do that. But you can fully customize it, but you still have the entire platform at your disposal, which makes it easy for you to do so. Monitoring. Well, we monitor it for you. Of course, there is still the interest, and I will touch on that later in the webinar. Can you also show that information to me as an end user? We will have some information on that later. But we monitor a lot of variables of all the deployments that we have running. And more important, we have really fine-tuned a lot of the alerting rules on that. So we can tell you in great detail now, if this is happening, then we need to intervene. If this is happening, then respond in that way, and so on. And then upgrades. This is actually the only topic here that I have given a slightly less bold check mark, because here you still have to do a lot of work yourself. And it's not the actual process of upgrading the database. We make that very easy for you. It's just saying edit and say update to this version, save, and the automation of Oasis does the rest. But as we saw before with upgrades, it's not just the process of upgrading the software part. You also want to take care of testing your application against a new version, preferably with the actual data. And here you're in luck, because we make it much easier for you to what we call clone from backup. So you can take a snapshot backup, say I'm taking my production data now, and I'm just cloning a deployment, even when it's for half an hour. And then you can upgrade that cloned deployment. It doesn't change anything in production. You have a test deployment, but a test deployment with actual data. And then you point your application to that, you upgrade the database, and you see what happens, and you run all the tests that you want to run in your application to make sure that it actually works with the newer version. And once you're done with it, you throw it away. It's that easy. And finally, the operational experience. I can tell you that we have spent a huge amount of time on gaining the operational experience, and we're extremely happy now with the information that we have. But let's be honest, we're still learning every day. And when there are new versions of the database, we're learning. When there are new versions of the underlying platform and the tooling that we're using, we're learning. So that's also for us a continuing story. Upgrades, here again on the slide, I already discussed it. So we have an automatic upgrade procedure. And the key part here to make it easier for you is the so-called clone from deployment from backup feature. All in all, the time that you spend on an upgrade is usually half an hour, plus of course the time that it takes to test your own application against it. Conclusion, if you run a database in production with Oasis, you don't need to spend that much time. You need a credit card to set it up. You don't need to have a lot of experience with ArangoDB. You can just run it. we have the migration of data, there are tooling for that. And after the launch of your deployment, you just use it. And hopefully you don't have to spend a lot of time on it, because we will do that for you. So the actual time that you spend there is a few hours. I see a question in the chat about how often there are upgrades. I assume that's a question about upgrades of the underlying database, because if you look at upgrades of the Oasis platform, then we're doing updates on a daily basis, but that doesn't change anything on the database itself, just the platform. If you look at the upgrades of the database, we have a policy within ArangoDB that we have a few months between what we call minor versions. So we currently are on version 3.7, and somewhere end of this year, beginning of next year, there will be a version 3.8. So that's when we're talking about new functionality and changes there. Patch versions come much more often, and that can be once every 3 weeks on average. Doesn't mean that you have to follow all of them, but actually in the second half of the webinar, there will be an issue on that as well. Good. Finally, for those managers out there or the developers that want to give a quick heads up for what is Oasis to a manager and why do you want to use Oasis instead of doing everything yourself, just have a look at this slide. Here's the comparison. If you do everything yourself, you're spending months. If you're doing it with Oasis, you pay a price every month, starting at $174 a month, and that's it. So just do the math. Good. Now I have spent a lot of time talking about all the issues that we believe are important, but I'm very happy that we have Ayal Rosenberg in the call from Weill, and Weill is one of our customers for Oasis. So Ayal, great that you're here. We are going through a couple of questions, and the first question that I have for you is, can you describe what Weill is doing? You're on mute.
Sorry. Hello, everyone. We're a startup based in South Africa, Johannesburg. We've been working with ArangoDB since we started, which was about 2.5 years ago. We're developing software as a service for the utility industry, mainly on the distribution side of utilities, which deals with electricity, water, and gas. And we're doing the entire life cycle of electricity, water, and gas, meaning metering, smart metering and manual metering, billing, charging, fault reporting, field worker, workforce inventory, and I think it's also fault management. We were supposed to launch most of our models in April. Corona hit us and we postponed the official launch of everything to next year, February. Okay. And in the various evolutions of the product and modules we've been building, we've been throwing more and more stuff at Arango, and I think about 80% of our storage and other needs are now taken care of by Arango. We moved to Oasis immediately it became available.
Can you, that's very interesting, Ayal. Can you tell me a little bit about, you mentioned 80% of your infrastructure is using ArangoDB. What kind of features of ArangoDB are you using?
Well, I can tell you, we had a lot of stuff on Redis. We had a lot of stuff on DynamoDB from AWS. We had a lot of stuff on MongoDB for our mapping and geospatial requirements. All of that stuff now has been moved on to ArangoDB. And the only the only element really that's not on ArangoDB at the moment is our time series data. And we've heard from you that that's also becoming available pretty soon. So we're eager to move over to your time series as well. And then I think we'll have everything then running on ArangoDB.
Sounds very good. Yeah, that's absolutely true. There is, with the version 3.8 of the database, so that's, let's say, time frame end of this year, there is a new model going to be added to ArangoDB, which is the time series. And then you not only have the graphs and the documents and the key values that we have nowadays, but we're adding time series to that. And of course, once that's available, we will also make it available on Oasis. Cool. Can you tell me a little bit about how you were running ArangoDB before Oasis existed? I know you were one of the first to jump on it, and what has actually changed now that you're using Oasis?
So very briefly, we were running Arango originally on AWS, and we had a few instances on DigitalOcean. The DigitalOcean instances was mainly for our software testing and our prototyping, and our production was running on AWS. We moved a lot of AWS from the application point of view onto Kubernetes clusters, but we were still using AWS to host our ArangoDB in production. One of the big issues we had were all the issues that you've actually outlined, was the maintenance, the monitoring, the security, the uptime. And something you didn't mention was the price, the cost. And the cost came in two ways. AWS wasn't cheap. And we actually had to have a full-time resource monitoring and managing our Arango instance. And really, when we moved over to Oasis, we replaced that DevOps engineer who was devoted to our database infrastructure ops with a developer, so we could develop more applications and spend less time on the DevOps side of things. Just remember, we've taken stuff off Redis, DynamoDB, MongoDB, even Elasticsearch, and put it onto Oasis. And I could actually, my DevOps guy now is doing full-time development. And frankly, the only DevOps we're doing on Oasis now is on Arango is our test environment, which is still running in DigitalOcean. If you ask me what we used to do, all I can say is I forgot, because we don't do it anymore, and we've just forgotten. So we don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah,
so we spent a lot of time, and it was a lot. I've just forgotten what we did there.
Yeah, well, we love to help you also get rid of your testing environment to at least from the self-managing part there. That's perfect. If there is anything that you would be able to add to either ArangoDB or Oasis, what would that be, Stuart?
Well, what was missing was the time series, and we heard the good news, so that's great. The other big issue we were having, and we still have it, is unlike with, for example, MongoDB, when we're running our unit tests, we would like an in-memory version so that we could actually run some tests on the in-memory version. And I can see you smiling, so that means something's in the pipeline there. But aside from that, we're very happy at the moment. It answers most of our needs.
Very good. Yeah. Well, the smiling is actually because one of the things that I'm going to talk about next. But let me first conclude here. Thank you very much for contributing. We appreciate it very much. And of course, if you have questions to Ayal later on, feel free to reach out to ArangoDB, and we're more than happy to forward that to Ayal. So thanks again, Ayal.
Thank you.
I'm continuing with the second part. And the second part is what has actually changed to Oasis since we launched. So what is new? And of course, we started when we launched about a year ago, we started with the standard functionality that you would expect from a database platform, a managed database, and what has changed over time. So here's a list of things, and it's definitely not the full list, but things were changing. The first is providers and regions. So since the launch, we made a rather large push to also add Microsoft Azure to the list, and we're currently on 3 providers. That's Microsoft Azure, AWS, and Google in, I think, 12, 13 regions, something like that. We're very happy that we are offering the entire functionality set on all our providers. So from that point of view, it doesn't really matter if you prefer AWS or whether you prefer Google or any one of them. We provide you with the same set of functions. Of course, the biggest question, or one of the big questions that we often get is, do you also support region, and then fill in some random region? We have had many requests there. We would love to, the way that we deal with that is, for us, it's relatively easy to add new regions. So if you need a new region, please reach out to us, send a request help ticket, and we keep track of the priority that way. And as soon as we have just a few requests for a region, we're more than happy to add that. So even when the region that you optimally would like to use is not in the list, just reach out to us and see what can be done. The second thing that we changed since the launch is about certificates, and more precise about well-known certificates. And I need to explain that a bit. When we're talking about encryption, and in this case, I'm talking about the network encryption part, you always work with certificates. Technically, those are X509 certificates. And these certificates are signed. There is an entire chain of certificates where somebody creates a root certificate, and then you use that to sign others and so on. And this is what's called a chain of trust. And the key part is that as soon as you start working with any website, you're using a standard browser, and these standard browsers are configured with a certain number of what are called root certificates. They know and trust these root certificates, and from that on, they can trust certificates that are signed with the root certificates, or signed with certificates that are signed with the root certificates, and so on. In contrast to what's called purely self-signed certificates. And self-signed certificates give a key pair. These things have worked with private and public keys, but they're not known by the browser. So if you use those in a browser, you initially get a big warning from the browser saying, I don't know this certificate, and do you really trust it? And that's not good for humans, because humans are immediately like, oh, this sounds wrong. So what we introduced, because we started out with the self-signed certificate, and what we introduced is so-called well-known certificates. Technically, that means that we're using Let's Encrypt, which is a very well-known and more or less open certificate authority nowadays, to give your deployments well-known certificates. Meaning, if you open them in a browser with pretty much any more or less recent browser, it's going to be accepted automatically. And that makes the acceptance for humans a lot easier to do. For machines, the opposite is sometimes true. For machines, you want, in many cases, you want to have self-signed certificates because you can explicitly configure a certain certificate. This is the one that I trust, and I'm using that one and not the other one. So what we did is we actually gave you both. We kept the self-signed certificates. We make them available on a higher port number. So if you want to use them for your machine-to-machine authentication, you can do that. If you want to use the web UI as a human, you benefit from the Let's Encrypt certificates. The next thing that we added, and we already discussed that with upgrades and backups, is clone deployments. We can now clone a deployment, so create a new deployment, but with the data of an existing one. And the way that that works is through backups. We have a great backup feature where you can very quickly take a backup, and then it takes a little bit of time to actually upload that to the cloud. But you can take literally a point in time and say, okay, this is the data that I want to clone. The typical use case there is I want to test either an upgrade of my database, or I want to test my application. There are various ways that you can use it. In all cases, it's very easy and very quick to make a clone. And once you're done with it, you just throw it away. It's not that important. Since we made it so easy to clone deployments and then also throw it away again, we also thought, and that's a change that is not even on this slide, but something that we introduced fairly recent, is also the option to lock certain resources. So when you make it so easy to add and remove things, you want to avoid that you're by mistake throw away your production database. So you can now lock your production database, and then you just cannot deploy it until, of course, you first unlock it. So it's just an extra, let's say, guardrail to protect human failures. And one of the changes that is very important that we introduced earlier this year is our API. And here I'm talking about the API of Oasis, not the API of ArangoDB. That doesn't change. And I will come back on the API in the next slides. Other than this list, there are numerous improvements in both the front end and the back end. There are way too many to mention, and we keep doing that. And we really appreciate all the feedback that we're getting from people saying, I would like to see this improved, or this doesn't work for me, I don't understand it, can you improve it? All these things. As I said before, we're literally making changes on a daily basis to our platform. We're trying to roll these changes out as quickly as we can. So it was definitely awesome to hear everyone's feedback on that. Now let's have a look at the API. For example, and this is actually an actual Oasis customer, what I'm talking about. This customer is building a multi-tenant security platform. And they're using the API to fully automatically spin up new deployments when they're adding tenants, and also removing deployments when the tenant is being removed. All of that is done automatically through our API, and they don't have to set up anything. And they build it, I think they build it with JavaScript, and they integrate with the Oasis API that way. That's one way of using it. Another example of the API is a customer that is using our API for CI testing of the application. So they have a nightly CI pipeline, and I think they even do it more often, but certainly during the night. They launch some jobs that spin up in the API, go through the entire cycle of creating a backup from their production data deployment, creating a test deployment from that using the clone deployment from backup functionality, run their entire application test set against that with actual production data. And that turns out that is really very helpful, because it's always these tiny details where you say, okay, my staging data is a bit more clean, or it doesn't have all the details. And when you run it against your real data, you just cannot beat that. And at the end of the CI pipeline, it automatically throws it away. And that's great because they're spinning it up and they're running a deployment for, I think, 2 hours anywhere in that area, and then throw it away again. Next night, doing exactly the same thing. All of these things can be done with our API. So a little bit more details on the API. What does it look like? The Oasis API, again, this is the Oasis API. There is also the API of the database. It's fully documented on the website. For the Oasis API, this is technically a gRPC API, which means that everything is specified in protocol buffers. And we make a client for that available in the Go language. But since it's gRPC with protocol buffers, you can automatically create clients for pretty much any modern language, whether it's Java or Rust, Python, PHP. The list is pretty long. You want to know more, go to grpc.io and have a look there. And the good part of the protocol buffers is it is so easy to generate a client. So it's no handwritten activity, it's just automatically created. And then the authentication on this API is done through what we call API keys. And the API keys is essentially a technical representation of yourself. So you can say, I'm Ewout and I'm using one of my API keys, but you can also separate others and set them up that way. And you can store these keys in typical secret stores and so on. Then the next thing of the API is, of course, not everyone wants to build software to interact with Oasis. So we also have a scriptable, could have called it version, but a command line interface. That's called Oasis CTL. That is available on our GitHub page. It's mentioned on this site. And it runs pretty much anywhere where you want. It's written in Go language and it compiles, and we have run it even on tiny Raspberry Pis, and you can just have a lot of fun with that. And it implements most of the API in a command line fashion. So you can do things like Oasis CTL, create deployment, give it a bunch of parameters, and it spins up a deployment for you. You can wait for it. So if you want to run, for example, in CI, Oasis CTL is definitely the tool to use. There is a side note here that just going through the code of Oasis CTL, we're not claiming that it's the most beautiful code you have ever written, but it's definitely a good example of using the Oasis API. So if you want to see the details of, hey, how are they doing, guys doing that, just have a look. It's open source. You can see it in action. Good. Finally, on our API, we also have a Terraform plugin that is still not in what we call a GA state. So there may still be changes, but we're trying to, that's definitely going to be improved over the next couple of months as well. Final part of the webinar. We've now seen what it takes to go from your developer workbench to production when you do it yourself, when you're doing it with Oasis. We have seen the improvements of Oasis from launch till now, and now we're going to have a look at what's actually next on the roadmap. And when I'm talking about the roadmap, I'm talking about the upcoming months. So it's not like this is a vision for the next couple of years. I want to highlight, we're doing a lot of different things, but I want to highlight 4 in particular. First is audit logs. Well, you could say, what is an audit log? An audit log in the context of Oasis means 2 things. You want to see exactly who is doing what, when, and where in your databases. So in the Oasis deployments, but you also want to see that who is doing what, where in the Oasis platform. You may want to know who is creating every deployment every night, who is creating new projects, who is doing all these kinds of things. You can do that with the audit logs. And we're going to bring that audit log functionality combined, so both from the information that we get out of the deployments, as well as the information that comes out of the platform. And we're going to store that information for you in cloud storage, S3, GCS, and so on. So you can fetch the information from the Oasis platform, of course, also through the API. and deal with that. But there is also a second possibility. And we know that the audit log is purely about trust. You want to know what has happened, and you also want to make sure that nobody messes around with that data. So we're going to, besides the fact that we're storing these events, because that's what we call them, in our own data store and make them available to you, even after your deployment is gone. We're also going to make it available for you to configure a service. Will be an HTTP service built by you, where you can actively, where we will actively push events while they happen to your service. What you do behind that service is completely up to you. So you can use it to store it in your own S3 bucket. You can use it to generate alerts. That's again completely up to you. But that will be available, and then you can again have a lot of fun and automate that. The next thing on the list is observability. I mentioned in the beginning about, we talked about monitoring, and we are going to, not so long ago, we introduced that in the server list. You can see what's going on right now with your servers in terms of memory and CPU. But we're going to extend upon that in two ways. One, the Oasis dashboard is going to have some very nice graphs where you can see all these aspects in much more detail over a period of time. So for the last at least 14 days, you will be able to see how your servers have performed, what memory they're using, CPU, and a lot of different metrics for the databases. But the other thing that we're going to add is the possibility to fetch that information yourself. So we're going to make a so-called endpoint available for the metrics for your deployment, where you can configure your own, in this case, Prometheus compatible server to fetch information, and then again do that with that information whatever you want. And you have all the details available that we have, of course, with the limitation that it's only about your deployment. And finally, two topics of automation. First of all, about auto upgrades. And this is a more elaborate subject. There is going to be a change in the upgrade policies that we have on Oasis. Right now we have, and that's the upgrading of databases. Right now, we make it easy for you to upgrade to a new version of the database. But we also see that it is hard for people to actually do that. And it's not hard because the actual activity is hard. As I said before, we make it easy with just saying, okay, select a new version and hit save, and it's done automatically. But as we saw before, it also means testing your application and so on. But we see that it is very important that you actually do upgrade to newer versions. And the most important reason for that is that we see that the engineering team at ArangoDB is very hard at work solving tiny things, in making improvements here and there, and we want to bring that to you guys. And it is for us very important that if we see that, for example, a certain bug happens and we see that happening in multiple deployments, we would say, it would be so nice if these customers could update. And what we are going to do is we're going to give you, very similar to all the majority of cloud providers, we're going to give you a so-called sliding window of versions. And as long as your deployment is in that window of versions, nothing happens. You can just do whatever you want and stay on it. The key part is what happens if you're out of that window. So let's say that you are currently on version 3.6.6, and at some point that version is going to be out of that window. We will then give you two options. One is you can go to the oldest version that is still in the window, or you can go directly to the recommended version within the window, which is in almost all cases a newer version, but not the latest version. So we're rather conservative in that. Of course, this is all going to be communicated with emails up front and saying, okay, you're going to be out of the version window soon, so please update. And if you don't, from this date on, your deployment will be automatically updated. So that's coming over the next couple of months. The last thing on the list is auto-scaling. And auto-scaling, you can think of auto-scaling with a number of different topics. The very first thing that we're going to tackle is auto-scaling of disk space. It's also the most important from what we hear in feedback from the customers. What that means is that you can give, now you give a disk size where you say, okay, I want to have 256 gigs of a disk per server. And instead of doing that, the next year you're going to say, I want to give them a disk space between 80 gigs and 512 gigs. And as soon as the system detects that you are approaching a certain usage of your disk, it's automatically going to increase the disk space for you. Of course, within the boundaries that you specify. This just means one less thing that you have to care about and keep an eye on. So in the end, it's going to make, hopefully, your life a little bit easier. After that, we're also going to work on other scaling aspects. So that's also scaling down, but also scaling node sizes automatically on certain parameters of your database. But those are the next steps that are coming. That's the roadmap for the next couple of months. And that is also the end of the topics that we wanted to discuss with you tonight. So now I'm open to having questions. Before I do that, I want to make everyone aware that we are currently very actively looking for all of your feedback. If you want to give us feedback, use the link that is on this slide. We're going to send the slides afterwards to everyone who subscribed. And we're also sharing this link in all the communication around Oasis. If you want to talk to us, if you have questions, if you want to give us feedback, please do use this link and make an appointment with either me or anyone else of the Oasis team. And the promise that we give to you is that this is going to be a developer to developer talk. So it's not going to be a sales meeting. It's definitely going to be, what are your needs and how can we help you with that? And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I see if there are any questions.